It was 2 in the morning when I heard the faint creak of the bedroom door. My heart pounded, but I kept my eyes closed, waiting. A shadow moved slowly across the carpet, careful steps muffled by socks. The air felt heavy as if the whole house was holding its breath. Then came the sound I had been waiting for. A sharp snap from the dresser drawer followed by a scream that tore through the silence. Cassie clutched her hand, her eyes wide with shock, the mousetrap dangling from her fingers like an accusation. The lamplight flicked on, and in the doorway Mark appeared. His face clouded with confusion. He looked at me, then at his wife, unsure what to believe. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat up steady, knowing this trap was only the beginning. Because what they did not know was that I had been silently recording every loss, every lie, every small piece of proof that would one day bring her to her knees. I was 62 when I first began to notice the small things disappearing. At first, I told myself it was just age catching up with me. A missing pen, a pair of reading glasses I swore I had left on the nightstand, a jar of coins I kept near the kitchen window. I tried to brush it off, tried to believe I had misplaced them. But there was a nagging whisper in the back of my mind telling me something was not right. I had lived in my house in Austin for over 30 years. It was the home where I raised my son Mark, the home where memories of laughter and family dinners still lingered in the walls. Now Mark was grown, married, and living here with me along with his wife Cassie. At first, I had welcomed the arrangement. Mark had insisted it was temporary, a way to save money while they got back on their feet. I agreed, telling myself it would be nice to have my family under one roof again. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere inside my home had shifted. Cassie was 32, bright on the surface, polite in front of others. But in private, there was a sharpness in her tone, a constant undercurrent of irritation, as if my very presence annoyed her. She did not raise her voice often, but her sighs, her pointed glances, the way she would slam a cupboard door just a little too hard, all of it made me feel like a guest in my own house. I tried not to let it get to me. I had been a school teacher for decades, and patience was second nature to me, but the missing things were harder to ignore. One evening, I went to retrieve a silver spoon that had belonged to my grandmother, a spoon I always used when stirring my tea. It was gone. I searched the entire kitchen, pulling out drawers, moving appliances. Nothing. Later, I noticed a bottle of prescription pills had vanished from the bathroom cabinet. These were not things I would simply lose track of. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I opened a small notebook I kept in my bedside drawer and wrote down the date, the item, and where I had last seen it. The act of recording it gave me a strange sense of control. I told myself that if I kept track, the pattern would become clear. Still, there were moments when I doubted myself. I would stand in the middle of my bedroom, heart pounding, wondering if Cassie was right when she made little comments about me being forgetful. Perhaps I was slipping. Perhaps memory was not as sharp as it once had been. But then I would touch the notebook hidden under my pillow and remind myself that even if I questioned my own mind, the words on those pages would not lie. The tension in the house grew heavier with each passing week. Meals were quiet, Mark trying to make small talk while Cassie picked at her food. I smiled when necessary, but inside I felt like I was tiptoeing across eggshells. I would catch Cassie watching me, her lips pressed into a thin line as if daring me to say something. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the living room window, I decided to polish a bracelet my late husband had given me on our 25th anniversary. I kept it in a small jewelry box tucked safely in the back of my dresser drawer. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the box. The bracelet was not there. I pulled everything out of the drawer. Scarves, old letters, photographs, even the little sachets of lavender I kept for scent. No bracelet. I felt my chest tighten as if someone had pressed a weight against me. That bracelet was more than jewelry. It was memory. It was love. It was proof that once upon a time I had been cherished deeply, and now it was simply gone. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the empty jewelry box. I stared at the doorway, half expecting Cassie to appear with that indifferent expression of hers. My mind raced with possibilities, with excuses, but the truth was clear. This was no accident. When Mark came home later that evening, he asked why dinner was not ready. I told him I had not felt well. He touched my arm gently, concern in his eyes, but behind him I saw Cassie roll her eyes. I swallowed my words, choosing silence. That night after they had gone to bed, I opened my notebook again. In neat handwriting, I added a new entry. Bracelet gold anniversary gift missing. I stared at the page until the ink blurred, then closed the book and slid it back into its hiding place. As I lay in the dark, the house quiet around me, I promised myself I would not be careless again. Every detail mattered now. Every loss would be noted. And though I did not yet know where it would lead, I understood one thing with chilling certainty. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I forced myself to move through the routine as if nothing had happened. I folded laundry, brewed coffee, and tidied the kitchen. But the empty space in my jewelry box kept pressing on my mind. I needed to test the waters to see if Cassie would give anything away. She was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling on her phone when I placed the basket of folded clothes nearby. I tried to sound casual as I said that I could not find my anniversary bracelet, the one with the small gold links. Cassie looked up slowly, her eyebrows lifting just enough to give an impression of surprise. She set her phone down and tilted her head. "Are you sure you had it?" "Nora?" "Maybe you misplaced it. You know, memory can get tricky at a certain age." Her voice was sweet on the surface, but there was a sharp edge hiding underneath. The words cut more than I expected. I had heard similar comments before, little hints that I was becoming forgetful. But this was different. She was not simply remarking. She was planting doubt, crafting a narrative where I was the unreliable one. Mark walked in just then, keys jingling in his hand. He overheard her and frowned. "What's going on?" I kept my tone even. I told him I could not find the bracelet and wondered if either of them had seen it. Cassie gave a small laugh and shook her head. "Nora's probably just misplacing things again. It happens." Mark's expression softened. "Mom, you do sometimes forget where you put things." "Remember the remote last week?" I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Yes, of course." Maybe I am just tired. I busied myself with putting dishes away, but my hands trembled. The conversation ended quickly, Mark distracted by a work call, Cassie slipping away into the living room. I stood alone at the sink, staring at the window where sunlight streamed in, feeling the ground shift beneath me. They had both entertained the idea that I was simply forgetful. Cassie had guided Mark there with such ease. Later that afternoon, I decided to probe again. I walked past the living room where she sat flipping through a magazine. I asked gently if she had moved the pill bottle from the bathroom cabinet because I could not find it. She did not look up, only smirked faintly and said, "Maybe I had taken more than I remembered." Her words hung in the air like smoke. I felt my cheeks warm, but I forced myself to nod, pretending to consider it. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote down everything. The bracelet, the pills, the exact phrases she used. I noted how Mark responded, how he seemed swayed by her calm certainty. The act of writing steadied me. Each line of ink was proof that I was not imagining this. The following days followed a similar rhythm. Something small would vanish. A scarf, a kitchen knife, even an old photograph of my husband that I had kept in a frame on my dresser. Each time I asked Cassie if she had seen it, she gave the same kind of answer, gentle on the outside but laced with accusation. Maybe you left it somewhere. Maybe you're getting a little absent-minded. When I brought these things up around Mark, he would hesitate. I saw confusion in his eyes, torn between defending me and accepting Cassie's calm logic. She always looked so composed, so sure of herself, while I felt the frustration simmering beneath my skin. One evening as we cleared the dinner table, I asked her if she remembered moving a set of silver teaspoons. I knew exactly where I had kept them wrapped in cloth inside the cabinet. She placed a plate into the dishwasher and without missing a beat said she had not touched them, but maybe I had. Then she turned slightly, just enough for me to see the flicker of a smile tug at her lips. It was not a warm smile, not a smile of reassurance. It was quick, sharp, and full of quiet triumph. I froze in place, holding a stack of bowls against my chest. For the briefest moment our eyes met. She knew I had seen it. She knew I understood. And yet she walked away, humming under her breath, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen. That night, when I returned to my room, I sat at the desk with the notebook open and stared at the blank page. My hand shook as I wrote down the date, the missing spoons, the exact expression on her face. The words steadied me, but a heaviness pressed against my chest. This was no longer about misplaced objects. This was deliberate. As I closed the notebook and slid it back under the mattress, I sat in silence, my heart pounding, knowing I had just crossed a threshold. Cassie was not careless or ignorant. She was playing a game, and she thought I was too weak to recognize it. I whispered to myself in the dark, promising that I would not let her win. That night, I pulled the notebook back out and studied what I had written so far. The pages were filled with hurried notes, but I knew it would not be enough. If I wanted to protect myself, I needed something more precise, more undeniable. I found an old folder in the back of my closet, the kind I used to keep lesson plans in when I was still teaching. I decided it would become my record, my personal archive. The next morning, I began carefully. I wrote the date, the time of day, and exactly what was missing. I added where I had last seen it and what its value might be. When I remembered, I took a quick photo with my phone, printing it later at the pharmacy downtown. I slipped each note and photograph into a clear plastic sleeve, building page by page. It felt clinical, almost like preparing a case for court. I told myself that even if Mark doubted me, even if Cassie tried to twist the story, the truth would be laid out in front of them one day. There would be no way to deny it. The log grew faster than I expected. A blouse, a bottle of perfume, even canned goods from the pantry vanished one by one. Some items had little monetary value, but each had weight in memory and meaning. I recorded them all. I numbered the pages, kept them neat, and placed the binder deep inside a drawer beneath folded sweaters. Every evening after dinner, when I heard Cassie running water in the kitchen or talking to Mark in the living room, I would retreat to my room. I slid the drawer open, pulled the binder out, and added the day's entry. Each sound in the hallway made my pulse quicken. I knew I had to be careful. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than usual from the grocery store. The house was unusually quiet. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed my bedroom door cracked open. I always shut it before leaving. My breath caught as I pushed it wider. Cassie stood near my dresser, her hand grazing the top as if searching for something. Her back was to me. She turned quickly when she heard the floor creak, her expression flashing surprise before settling into a smooth smile. "Oh, I was just looking for some extra laundry baskets," she said lightly, though her eyes darted to the corner where the drawer sat. I forced a calm expression and answered that the baskets were in the laundry room, not in my bedroom. She nodded, brushed past me, and walked out with casual ease. But I felt my stomach knot. She had been looking for my evidence. She suspected I was keeping track. That night I could barely sleep. I kept replaying the sight of her near my dresser, her fingers inches away from the hidden drawer. I realized that my binder was not as safe as I thought. I needed a better hiding place. The following morning, after Cassie left to run errands, I pulled the binder out and wrapped it in an old pillowcase. I carried it to the garage where a set of storage boxes sat stacked against the wall. I slid the binder into the bottom of one marked Christmas lights, covering it with tangled strings and ornaments. My hands trembled as I closed the lid. It was not perfect, but it was safer than the bedroom drawer. When I returned inside, Mark asked what I was doing in the garage. I told him I was reorganizing old holiday decorations. He barely looked up from his laptop, nodding absently. I felt a pang of loneliness knowing how little he saw of what was happening right under his roof. Days passed and my binder grew thicker. Each missing item became another entry, another piece of the puzzle. I sometimes lingered over the photographs, the sharp images of objects that had once felt ordinary, but now seemed like evidence of betrayal. One evening, I was folding laundry in the living room when Cassie walked by. She bent to pick up a dropped sock, and I noticed her eyes flicker toward the hallway toward my bedroom door. The look was quick but unmistakable. She was still searching. Later that week, I came home again to find the bedroom window open, the curtains swaying in the breeze. I never left it open when I went out. My heart pounded as I checked the drawer where the binder had once been. Empty, of course, but I imagined her rifling through it, convinced she would find something. She had not found the binder in the garage. Not yet. The tension in the house thickened. Cassie remained pleasant in front of Mark, offering to cook or suggesting movies for them to watch. But whenever our eyes met alone, there was a silent battle being waged. She knew I was watching, and I knew she was hunting. One night after she and Mark went to bed, I tiptoed to the garage. I lifted the lid of the Christmas box just to be sure. The binder was still there, wrapped and untouched. Relief washed through me, though it did not last long. I realized she would keep trying. She would not stop until she either broke me or uncovered what I was protecting. I closed the box and pressed my palm against the lid. My notebook had become more than notes and photographs. It was my shield, my lifeline. If she ever discovered it, everything would collapse. As I walked back through the dark hallway, I caught sight of her shadow beneath the door of the bedroom she shared with Mark. She was awake, waiting, listening. My chest tightened. She had not caught me, not yet, but the game was far from over. I woke the next morning with a plan. My binder was safe for now, but I needed proof that Cassie was taking things with her own hands. I remembered an old pair of earrings tucked away in a drawer, nothing valuable, just cheap costume jewelry I had bought years ago for a school play. They looked convincing enough shiny under the light, but they were worthless. They would serve as bait. I placed one of the earrings in a small velvet box and slid it into the jewelry drawer in my bedroom. I left the box half open just enough to catch the eye. My heart pounded as I closed the drawer and stepped away. The trap was set. For 2 days, I watched carefully. I kept the door to my room slightly ajar, pretending to do chores nearby, listening for footsteps. Cassie drifted in and out of the hallway, her movements casual, but her eyes always lingering too long on my door. She thought I was careless. She thought I was forgetful. On the third afternoon, while I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, I heard the faint creak of my bedroom floor. I froze, straining to catch every sound. When I finally stepped quietly down the hallway and peeked around the corner, the drawer of my dresser stood open. The box was gone. My chest tightened not with surprise, but with confirmation. That evening, I waited until Mark returned from work. I wanted him to hear it directly, to see with his own eyes what was happening. After dinner, when Cassie was clearing the plates, I walked into the living room where Mark sat on the couch. "Mark, could you come with me for a moment?" I asked softly. He followed me into the bedroom. I opened the jewelry drawer and gestured inside. "The box is gone," I said. "It was here this morning." Cassie appeared at the doorway, her eyes narrowing. "What box?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "The one with the earrings," I said, keeping my voice calm. "They were just costume jewelry, but they are missing." Her face flushed and she stepped further into the room. "Are you seriously accusing me again, Nora? Do you hear yourself? You are obsessed." Mark looked between us, confusion clouding his expression. "Honey, Mom just said something is missing," he started. But Cassie cut him off. She spun toward him, her voice rising. "This is ridiculous. Your mother is losing it. She blames me for everything that goes missing. Maybe she misplaced it. Maybe she threw it out, but I am not going to stand here and be treated like a thief in my own home." The words stung, but I held my ground. "I know what I put in that drawer," I said firmly. Cassie's eyes blazed. She jabbed a finger toward me. "You are paranoid, and you are making this house miserable with your constant suspicion." Mark raised his hands as if to calm the storm, but his eyes flickered in a way I had never seen before. For the first time, doubt had slipped into his expression. He looked at me, then at her, and I could see the questions beginning to form in his mind. Cassie noticed it too. She turned to him, her tone suddenly softer, almost pleading. "You don't believe her over me, do you? You know how forgetful she has been." Mark hesitated. His gaze lingered on mine, searching for reassurance, searching for certainty. For a moment, I thought he might finally stand beside me, but then his shoulders dropped and he let out a weary sigh. "Let's not do this tonight," he said quietly. "Maybe the earrings will turn up." Cassie seized the opening and wrapped her arms around him. "That's right," she said smoothly, resting her head on his shoulder. "We need peace in this house, not accusations." I stood still, my hands gripping the edge of the dresser. The sting of betrayal pressed heavy in my chest. His silence spoke louder than words. He had seen her temper, he had seen her lose control, but he chose to look away. As they left the room, Cassie glanced back at me. For a fraction of a second, her lips curved in the faintest smirk, triumphant and mocking. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my body trembling, but my mind sharper than ever. The trap had worked. I had watched her take the bait and then spin the story to her advantage. Mark's wavering eyes told me he was no longer entirely convinced of her innocence. He might not admit it yet, but a crack had formed. I pulled out my notebook that night and wrote every detail down, from the placement of the earrings to her exact words and the way Mark's voice faltered. I pressed the pen harder into the paper than usual, etching the memory with precision. The silence of the house felt heavier than ever, broken only by the muffled sound of Cassie's laughter drifting down the hallway. It was a laughter meant for him, but carried like a blade to me. I closed the notebook, slid it into the binder hidden in the garage, and stood there for a long moment in the dark. I told myself this was only the beginning. I had tested her once, and she had failed. There would be more traps, more proof, until even Mark could no longer turn away. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with the look in Mark's eyes and the smug curve of Cassie's mouth. I knew then I needed more than a notebook hidden in the garage. I needed someone who would believe me, someone who would guide me before the situation consumed me. The next morning, I drove across town to see David Miller, an old friend from my teaching days who had become a respected family lawyer. He welcomed me into his office, the walls lined with law books and framed certificates. David had always carried a calm, steady presence, and as soon as I sat across from him, I felt some of the weight lift from my shoulders. I told him everything. The missing objects, the log I had been keeping, the cheap earring I had planted, and the way Cassie had twisted the story until even my son chose silence over confrontation. My voice shook at times, but I pressed on, laying every detail on the table like evidence in court. David leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, listening without interruption. When I finished, he let out a slow breath. "Nora, you're doing the right thing by documenting everything, but you need to keep at it. If this ever comes to a legal dispute, suspicion won't matter. Evidence will. Dates, times, values, anything you can record, keep it. It may feel exhausting, but it's your strongest shield." I nodded, clutching my purse in my lap. "I already have a binder started," I admitted. "Every entry is detailed." "Good," he said firmly. "Keep building it. And Nora, don't confront her directly anymore. The more you stay calm and quiet, the more careless she might become." As I left his office, sunlight spilling across the downtown sidewalks, I felt steadier. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't crazy. I had a plan, and now I had a lawyer reminding me that silence and patience were my allies. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Linda from next door tending to her rose bushes. Linda had lived beside me for almost 20 years, a warm woman with sharp eyes who missed nothing that happened in our cul-de-sac. She straightened and waved me over. "Nora," she said with a slight frown. "I don't mean to meddle, but I thought you should know I saw something odd last night." My stomach tightened. "What did you see, Linda?" She glanced toward my house before lowering her voice. Around 11, I was closing my curtains when I noticed Cassie walking out to her car. She was carrying a big tote bag, and she looked around like she didn't want anyone to see. She put it in the trunk and drove off. Didn't get back for about an hour. I gripped the fence post between us, my heart thudding. "Are you sure, Linda?" She gave me a knowing look. "I may be old, but my eyes work just fine. I know what I saw. If you ever need me to speak up about it, I will." Gratitude swelled in my chest. "Thank you, Linda. That means more than you know." As I walked back into the house, Cassie breezed past me in the hallway, her phone in hand, humming lightly as if nothing were amiss. The contrast between her casual demeanor and Linda's words sent a chill through me. How many nights had she slipped away unnoticed, carrying pieces of my life with her? Later that night, I opened my binder and added a new entry. I described Linda's observation in detail, marking the time, and Cassie's suspicious absence. I tucked the binder back into its hiding place, pressing the lid down with resolve. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't alone anymore. David had given me direction, Linda had offered her eyes and her voice, and slowly the walls of isolation that Cassie had built around me were beginning to crack. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, listening to the distant sound of Cassie laughing at some show in the living room. The sound no longer crushed me the way it once had. Instead, I thought of Linda watching from her window, of David sitting calmly behind his desk, and I felt a quiet strength return. The house still held tension sharp and bitter, but beneath it, there was something else growing, a sense that the truth was no longer mine alone to carry. A few mornings later, I was sipping my coffee when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering, half expecting another robocall, but a young woman's voice came through soft yet urgent. "Mrs. Harris, my name is Emily Carter. I used to work with Cassie. I hope I'm not crossing a line, but I think you deserve to know some things." My breath caught. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound as I gripped the phone tighter. Emily continued, words tumbling quickly. "I was in real estate at Oakwood Realty in Dallas. Cassie was there for about a year, but she was fired. She was caught altering client paperwork, misreporting figures on a property deal. It was serious enough that the company wanted to press charges, but she made a deal to quietly leave." I pressed my hand against the counter to steady myself. Emily's voice carried no bitterness, only a need to set the record straight. I had heard Cassie brag about her brief career in real estate, how she left because the environment was toxic, how clients adored her. Never once had she admitted to fraud. Emily told me she still had some of the old emails, along with a memo from management documenting what had happened. "I can forward them to you if you'd like," she said carefully. "I know it may help you." "Yes, please," I whispered, hardly trusting my voice. Within an hour, her email arrived. I opened the attachments one by one, my hands trembling as the words blurred on the screen. There were email chains where Cassie pressured colleagues to overlook discrepancies. There was a scanned document signed by the company's director citing falsification of client records as grounds for termination. The more I read, the heavier the air seemed to grow around me. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my palm to my forehead, my heart thudding against my ribs. This wasn't petty theft anymore. This wasn't just a strained relationship between a mother-in-law and her son's wife. Cassie had a history, a trail of manipulation and deceit that stretched beyond my home. I printed every email, every memo, carefully hole-punched, and added them to my binder. As the stack grew thicker, a strange clarity settled over me. Each page I slid into its plastic sleeve felt like tightening a knot in a rope that Cassie herself had been weaving. When I closed the binder, I kept my hand on the cover for a long moment. I thought about Emily brave enough to reach out to a stranger, and about the chance that maybe others knew of Cassie's schemes too. That evening, as I folded laundry in the den, Cassie sauntered in with her phone pressed to her ear, laughing lightly at something on the other end. She caught my eye, and her smile flickered the same polished expression she wore at family dinners. But I noticed something underneath, a faint twitch in her jaw, as if she sensed something shifting. I said nothing, only placed another shirt on the stack and let my silence linger. Inside, though, I was alight with a new resolve. I had witnesses now. I had documents. The binder hidden behind the false panel in my closet was no longer a simple collection of missing trinkets. It was becoming a case file thick with patterns, history, and corroboration. Later that night, when the house had quieted and the distant hum of traffic was all that reached my ears, I returned to my bedroom and pulled the binder from its hiding place. I flipped through the pages, from the earliest notes about a missing brooch to the freshly printed evidence from Dallas. The arc of Cassie's deceit was no longer invisible. It was laid bare in black and white. I wrote one last entry before closing it for the night. Received corroboration from former co-worker Emily Carter. Fraudulent history confirmed. Evidence secured. As I slid the binder back into the panel, I felt my chest expand with something I hadn't felt in months. Not joy, not relief exactly, but the sharp knowledge that the walls were closing in. Cassie could still smile, could still toss her hair and laugh at jokes, but the truth was already woven into a net she could not see. And when the time came, that net would drop, and she would have nowhere left to turn. The following morning, the sunlight crept through the blinds and woke me earlier than usual. I brewed coffee, sat down at the dining table, and began sorting through another pile of bills and bank statements. My eyes skimmed over the familiar numbers until one particular envelope caught my attention. It was from the bank branch I rarely dealt with, the one where I had a small savings account I barely touched. I tore it open expecting some promotional flyer or a routine notice about interest rates. What I found instead made my pulse race. On the first page near the bottom sat my signature. At least it looked like mine at first glance. The curve of the N, the slant of the R, the looping tail of the H, it was all familiar yet wrong. I knew my handwriting better than anyone. This was not mine. I flipped quickly to the second page and froze. A withdrawal slip. $5,000 transferred out without my knowledge. The number seemed to scream at me, printed in bold ink, mocking me for not noticing sooner. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and paced the kitchen. My breath came uneven, shallow. I touched my chest, half expecting my heart to pound its way out of my rib cage. Every thought I had circled back to one person: Cassie. She was the only one with regular access to my documents, the only one who had shown both the motive and the audacity. Footsteps upstairs made me flinch. Mark's voice drifted down, humming some tune as he prepared for work. I stuffed the papers back into the envelope, slid it beneath a stack of magazines on the counter, and forced myself to steady my breathing. Cassie's laughter floated from the back porch, carefree, sweet, almost theatrical. She had no idea what had just landed in my hands. The rest of the morning dragged like a heavy chain. I pretended to read the newspaper, nodded when Cassie chatted about grocery lists, but inside my mind I rehearsed my next step. By the afternoon, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door quietly, and pulled the envelope back out. With trembling fingers, I dialed David's number. His voice, deep and calm, grounded me the moment he answered. I told him what I found, every detail of the letter, the forged signature, the missing money. I described how my name had been copied almost perfectly, except for the exaggerated tail at the end, something Cassie must have practiced until she thought it was believable. David was silent for a moment, which only made me more anxious. Finally, he said in that careful, measured tone he used when he wanted me to listen closely, "Nora, this is fraud. This is identity theft. If the bank confirms you didn't authorize it, she has committed a federal crime." He told me to make copies, to photograph everything, and to secure the originals in a safe place. He said evidence like this could be the keystone in any legal case. After hanging up, I sat motionless for a while, staring at the papers spread across my quilt. Then I stood, grabbed my phone, and began photographing every page. I adjusted the angle, zoomed in on the handwriting, snapped close-ups of the account number. I even filmed a short video of myself flipping through the documents while stating the date and time aloud. My voice shook, but I forced myself to be clear. When I finished, I slid the originals into a plastic sleeve and clipped them into my binder. The sound of the rings snapping shut was sharp final. I placed the binder back into its hiding spot behind the false panel of the closet, pressing it deep until it disappeared into darkness. My fingers lingered on the wood as if sealing away not just paper, but months of fear and doubt. Later that evening, I set the dinner table while Cassie prepared a casserole. She moved gracefully, smiling, asking if I wanted more salt or if I thought the oven timer was set correctly. On the surface, she was a perfect daughter-in-law. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was burning with the knowledge of what she had done. When our eyes met across the kitchen, hers lingered for a beat too long. I wondered if she sensed the shift in me, if she suspected that I finally had something solid, something undeniable. At dinner, Mark mentioned maybe planning a weekend trip to San Antonio. Cassie giggled, touched his arm, and leaned into him as if everything in our lives was ordinary. I forced a smile, nodded along, all the while thinking of the envelope hidden upstairs. Every laugh from her lips felt like another layer of deceit covering the truth. That night, after the dishes were done and the house grew quiet, I sat at my desk again. I wrote in my journal describing the day, the moment I saw the forged signature, the way my stomach dropped when I read the amount. I wrote about the trembling in my hands and how David's words echoed like a verdict. I promised myself in writing that I would not confront her yet. Patience had brought me this far. Patience would deliver justice. As the clock neared midnight, I closed the journal and slipped it next to the binder. I whispered to myself that this was no longer about trinkets or jewelry. She had stepped into territory that could destroy me financially, that could strip me of security in my old age. She thought I was weak, forgetful, too soft to fight back. But she underestimated me. I turned off the lamp, climbed into bed, and lay in the darkness. Cassie's laughter still echoed faintly from earlier. It no longer bothered me. My fear had shifted into something firmer. Determination. Resolve. The lasso I had been quietly tightening around her life had just drawn closer, and this time the knot would hold. When sleep finally came, it wasn't fractured and restless like before. It was steady, grounded, almost peaceful, because I knew now that I was armed with more than suspicion. I had proof, and proof was the one thing she couldn't twist into a lie. The day of Ethan's birthday arrived with balloons tied to the mailbox and the sound of children's laughter carrying across the yard. I baked cookies that morning and carried them over on a tray, determined to keep my composure no matter what unfolded. The backyard had been decorated with streamers, and a rented bounce house stood in the corner, already filled with squeals and energy. Mark greeted me warmly. Ethan ran up to hug my legs, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe in the sweetness of family. Cassie was radiant in a new dress, bustling about with guests and showing off the carefully wrapped gifts stacked on the table. She spoke louder than usual, making sure everyone heard her mention the brand names of the toys and gadgets she had picked out. People nodded politely, some impressed, others less so. I stood near Linda, who offered me a knowing look, the kind that asked silently if I was holding up. I smiled faintly, letting her know I was fine. The party moved into the kitchen when it was time for cake. The air smelled of frosting and candles, and Pastor James, who often attended family gatherings, offered a short prayer before Ethan blew out the flames. Everyone clapped and cheered. Cassie clapped the loudest, her bracelets jingling as her hand shot up, and that was the moment Linda's eyes narrowed. She leaned closer to me and whispered almost under her breath, "Nora, isn't that your bracelet?" My breath caught. I followed her gaze to Cassie's wrist. The silver glinted under the light, the familiar design impossible to mistake. My anniversary bracelet. The one I thought had vanished into thin air months ago. It sat there as if it had always belonged to her, as if the memories tied to it meant nothing. The chatter of the guests softened as more people noticed. A murmur spread, subtle but unmistakable. I saw two women at the edge of the table whisper and glance toward me. Even Pastor James's kind eyes followed the bracelet, his brows knitting slightly as though he recognized the tension creeping into the room. Cassie, oblivious or perhaps willfully blind, raised her arm higher as she helped Ethan unwrap his new bicycle helmet. She smiled, laughing, the bracelet sparkling with every movement. My fingers dug into the side of the table. I felt heat rush to my face, a storm of anger and vindication all tangled together. Mark stood nearby, his smile faltering as his gaze landed on her wrist. He didn't say a word, but the way he stared told me he saw it too. His expression shifted, the easy confidence cracking, giving way to doubt. The silence between them was heavier than any accusation I could have voiced. Linda reached for her glass of punch, her eyes still on me. "If you ever need me, I saw it," her look seemed to say. Around us, the guests continued their polite conversations, though the tone had changed. The air was tighter, filled with curiosity and suspicion. I forced myself to serve cake to pass plates to keep the peace. Ethan's laughter rang out innocent, unburdened by the undercurrent swirling around him. I would not let his birthday be ruined, not by Cassie's arrogance. As the children returned to the yard, I found myself next to Pastor James by the sink. He placed a gentle hand on my arm and spoke quietly. I noticed the bracelet, Nora. If you need someone to vouch for what was seen here today, I will. His words were steady, reassuring, like a small anchor in turbulent water. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Thank you, Pastor, I whispered back. It meant more than I could say. Across the room, Mark still hadn't taken his eyes off Cassie. She felt his stare eventually, because her laughter pitched slightly higher, more brittle, though she continued her performance as if nothing was wrong. His jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a line. For the first time, I saw a fracture in the wall he had built around his loyalty to her. When the presents were opened and the children tore through wrapping paper with glee, Cassie leaned against the counter, sipping from her glass, unaware that every sparkle from her wrist chipped away at the image she had tried so carefully to maintain. I stood back, quiet, steady, watching, recording the scene in my memory as vividly as if I had captured it with a camera. My journal would hold the words later, but my heart already knew the truth. The web was no longer invisible. Others could see the threads now. Mark's face told the story without sound, the doubt growing, the trust faltering. And though he said nothing, his silence thundered louder than any defense he might have offered. The party wound down with polite goodbyes and bags of candy handed to children. The sun dipped lower, the backyard slowly emptying. I kissed Ethan's forehead, wished him many happy years, and held his little arms tight for a moment longer than usual. As I left the house, I glanced back through the window. Cassie was still wearing the bracelet, still smiling, but Mark's eyes were locked on it, his face shadowed with questions he could no longer push aside. It was the first visible crack in her facade, and I knew it would only widen. The drive home after the party felt heavier than usual, though the car was quiet. I sat in the back seat, staring at the lights of Austin rolling past the window, my mind no longer racing with questions, but beginning to form answers. I could sense Mark's unease from the way he gripped the steering wheel, and Cassie's forced chatter as she tried to smooth over the awkward moment when Linda noticed the bracelet. Ethan had fallen asleep, his head resting against the car seat, innocent and unaware. That image only deepened my resolve. When I stepped inside my house later that night, the weight of everything pressed on me at once. I hung up my coat, locked the door, and walked into my study. The air was still, and the faint smell of old paper and polished wood wrapped around me. For months, I had been gathering scraps of truth, and now those scraps had turned into a mountain. I pulled the hidden folder from its place, laid it on the desk, and began spreading out the documents like a dealer laying down cards. My notebook, filled with careful entries of each missing item, lay open, pages wrinkled from use. The photos of jewelry boxes with gaps where heirlooms had once been sat beside printouts of emails from Emily describing Cassie's past schemes at her old company in Dallas. I added the statement from Pastor James written neatly in his firm hand, and Linda's handwritten note about seeing Cassie with the bag in the middle of the night. Each piece of evidence had once been a lonely fragment, but together they formed a net. My eyes moved from one page to another, and I could almost see Cassie's arrogance unraveling in front of me. I organized everything into sections, labeling each tab with precision: losses, witness testimonies, financial documents, employment history, forgery. Each folder was thick, and as I stacked them neatly, the weight of truth felt almost physical, pressing against the desk. I picked up the copy of the forged bank document again. The curve of my name, imitated but careless, glared up at me. It was like looking at a mask of my own face. My stomach clenched with anger, but it was no longer the wild, desperate anger that had shaken me before. It was steady, sharp, like the edge of a blade honed over time. I thought of the moment in the living room when Linda's voice had cut through the party chatter, naming the bracelet on Cassie's wrist. I remembered Mark's eyes, wide and uncertain, fixed on his wife. That was the first visible crack in his loyalty, and it gave me a glimpse of the truth making its way through. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the folders. This was no longer just about missing objects. It was about lies, betrayal, manipulation, and the safety of my home. If Cassie had the boldness to steal from under my roof and forge my name, where would she stop? I whispered softly to myself, the words slipping out before I realized it. This ends soon. The house was silent. Only the faint tick of the hallway clock reached me. I began slipping each folder into a large black binder, one after the other, pressing them down and smoothing the pages flat. The binder grew thick and heavy, its spine bulging with truth. When I closed it with a snap, the sound startled me in the quiet. It was the sound of finality, of something sealed. I ran my hand across the surface of the binder, feeling the ridges of the tabs beneath. This was my shield and my sword. I had felt alone for so long, doubting my memory, my instincts, even my worth. Cassie's words had sliced at me, convincing Mark that age was twisting my mind. But the binder in front of me was proof that I had not lost myself. I thought of David, his calm voice urging me to be patient, to keep collecting. I imagined placing this binder in front of him, and the way his brow would rise as he turned each page. I thought of Linda, ready to speak if needed, and of Pastor James, who would not bend his integrity for anyone. I was not standing on this battlefield alone anymore. I opened the binder one last time and looked at the photographs of my missing things. The gold locket my husband had given me on our 20th anniversary, gone. The brooch from my mother, gone. My wedding ring that I sometimes wore on a chain, gone. But the images were here, captured, undeniable. Each absence had a witness now. I touched the edge of the photo of the forged signature, again my hand steady this time. This was the line Cassie had crossed that she could not retreat from. She had not only stolen my possessions, she had stolen my identity. That act turned suspicion into certainty. As I closed the binder again and locked it in the drawer, I felt my breathing slow, a strange calm settling in. The storm was far from over, but the ground beneath me no longer shook. I rose from the chair, turned off the lamp, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the desk where the binder rested. My voice came out low, almost like a prayer, but steadier than any prayer I had whispered in years. Now, you will have no way to deny it. Then I shut the door to the study, the soft click of the latch echoing in the still night, carrying the promise of what was to come. The afternoon sun poured through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the living room floor as I set the chairs in a circle. My hands trembled slightly while I arranged the binder on the coffee table, but it was not from fear. It was from the weight of what was about to happen. I had waited months for this moment, and now the truth would finally step into the light. The doorbell rang first, with David's familiar voice greeting me. Then Linda followed, her eyes filled with quiet encouragement. Emily arrived next, clutching her leather purse tightly, her face determined but uneasy. Pastor James entered with a calm dignity, his presence alone grounding the room. Finally, Mark and Cassie came together, Mark looking uncertain, Cassie smiling too widely, her voice syrupy as she said, "What a nice idea it was to have everyone over." I motioned for them all to sit. My heart pounded as I closed the door and stood before them. The room felt smaller than ever, filled with people, and an invisible tension that pressed on every corner. I pulled the binder from the table and placed it in front of me. Cassie's eyes flicked to it immediately, her smile twitching. I spoke slowly, each word measured. For months, things have gone missing in this house. At first, I thought it was my memory, but I decided to keep records, and those records tell a different story. I opened the binder, flipping to the first section. Photographs of missing jewelry watches and small keepsakes lay across the pages. I held up one of the photos, my wedding ring on the chain it used to rest on. Linda leaned forward, nodding quietly as if to confirm the reality in front of her. Cassie let out a small laugh, her voice sharp. "Nora, you misplace things all the time. You're making something out of nothing." Linda's voice cut through, firm and unwavering. "I saw you, Cassie. That night you carried a bag to your car when the house was dark. I remember the way you looked around before leaving." Cassie's face froze for a moment before she turned to Mark, her tone dripping with disbelief. "You're really going to believe this, a neighbor spying in the middle of the night?" Mark shifted uneasily but didn't speak. His silence filled the room like an echo. I turned another page showing emails Emily had sent me. Emily cleared her throat and spoke softly but clearly. "At the company in Dallas, Cassie altered contracts and shifted money. We caught her and she was dismissed. I kept the records and I thought Nora should see them." Cassie's voice rose higher, trembling with anger. "That's ridiculous! You're just bitter because you were jealous of me back then." Emily didn't flinch. "I brought the documents," she said, pulling papers from her bag and placing them beside the binder. I felt Cassie's eyes burn on me, but I continued flipping further into the binder. Photocopies of receipts, bank statements, notes, all stacked neatly. Each page was a step closer to the truth she had tried so hard to bury. Pastor James, who had been silent until then, leaned forward with his steady gaze. "I saw that bracelet on your wrist at Ethan's party. It was the same one Linda recognized, the one Nora's husband gave her years ago." That moment disturbed me deeply, Cassie. Cassie's mask began to crack. She snapped back at him, her voice shrill. "Are you all against me now? Over a piece of jewelry?" Mark ran a hand over his face, his shoulders slumping. He looked torn, his loyalty battling with the gnawing truth he could no longer avoid. I drew a deep breath and turned to the final section of the binder. My fingers lingered on the page before I slid out a sheet and laid it flat on the table. The forged bank document my name scrawled in her hand sat exposed under the afternoon light. The room went utterly silent. Even the ticking clock in the hallway seemed to stop. Mark leaned forward, his face pale. "That's Mom's signature, but it's not hers." David spoke calmly, his lawyer's voice steady as stone. "This is forgery. It's a felony offense." Cassie's lips parted, but no words came out. She opened her mouth as if to deny it, then closed it again, her eyes darting from the paper to Mark's face. My voice was quiet, but strong. "You tried to take my name. Cassie. You crossed every line." The silence thickened, pressing on all of us. Mark stared at the document as though the ground beneath him had split open. Cassie's hands trembled, her wide eyes flashing with desperation. No one moved. The truth sat on the table undeniable, and for the first time in months I felt the air shift in my favor. The moment held heavy and unbroken, as if the house itself waited for what would happen next. Cassie's eyes darted across the room, her breath coming quick and shallow as if the walls were pressing in on her. The fury that had carried her through every denial seemed to dissolve, and what replaced it was a raw panic that left her voice trembling. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered, though no one had asked her a question. Her shoulders shook as she sank back into the chair, covering her face with both hands. Her makeup smudged streaks of black trailing down her cheeks. She gasped between sobs, but the room remained quiet. No one rushed to comfort her. No one defended her. Mark stared at the floor, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles turned white. For years he had stood between his wife and the truth, but in that silence his defenses cracked. He raised his head, his voice low but steady. "I can't keep doing this. Cassie, I can't keep lying to myself." Cassie pulled her hands away, her eyes swollen, and looked at him with disbelief. "You don't mean that. You can't mean that." Mark's jaw tightened. "I do. I can't protect you from this. Not anymore." The words landed heavy like a gavel striking wood. Cassie's sobs grew louder, but Mark didn't move to console her. He sat still, his gaze fixed on the evidence scattered across the table. Pastor James shifted in his seat, his usually warm eyes filled with sorrow. He shook his head slowly, his voice low but clear. "You had a chance to change, Cassie. You had people who trusted you, and you threw it away." Cassie cried harder, her words spilling out in fragments. I thought I could. It wasn't supposed to." Linda crossed her arms, her expression sharp and cold. "I've seen enough. All this time you smiled in my face, and behind closed doors, you were stealing from the very woman who let you live under her roof." Cassie shrank under Linda's glare, her sobs turning into shallow whimpers. She looked small, crumpled in her chair, no longer the woman who once carried herself with sharpness and control. Mark's voice broke through the air again, firmer this time. "We're done, Cassie. I can't call this a marriage anymore. We'll separate. I'll speak to a lawyer tomorrow." Cassie froze her crying, halting for a moment as the words struck her like a blow. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her body folded forward, her forehead nearly touching her knees, as if she were trying to disappear into the floor. The room was unbearably heavy, every breath measured and slow. The weight of all that had been said and revealed seemed to settle on everyone's shoulders, but no one carried it more than Cassie. She had been stripped of her lies, her charm, her ability to twist words. I sat still watching her crumble. This was not triumph, not exactly. It was the raw, painful collapse of someone who had built her life on deceit, and now the foundation was gone. David finally spoke, his tone clinical, yet edged with finality. "This will move quickly now. The law doesn't ignore forged documents." Cassie made a strangled sound, but she didn't lift her head. Her body curled tighter as if the shame alone was enough to break her down. I glanced around the room. Linda's jaw was set in anger. Pastor James closed his eyes briefly as though in prayer. Emily watched in silence, her expression unreadable. And Mark sat there, shoulders heavy, his face lined with exhaustion as though he had aged years in the span of an evening. Cassie's cries softened into a low, broken rhythm. No more excuses, no more fire in her voice. Only the hollow sound of someone who knew the world had turned its back on her. The house was quiet, except for those quiet sobs. The people around her, once family and community, now stood as witnesses to her fall. It was in that silence that I realized something had shifted permanently. Cassie was no longer the force in the room. She was no longer the one who twisted truths or made me doubt myself. She was nothing more than a figure bent low, drowned in her own undoing, left with nothing but the consequences she had long tried to outrun. No one spoke again. The stillness carried more weight than words ever could. And in that stillness, Cassie sat brought to her knees alone in the ruins she had made. The morning after felt strangely quiet, like the house itself was catching its breath. I brewed coffee in the kitchen, letting the smell fill the space that had once been heavy with doubt and mistrust. The evidence, the tears, the confrontation, all of it lingered in my mind, but there was also a sense of release, as though I had finally stepped out from under a shadow. I decided I needed something new, something alive to remind me of gentler things. A few weeks later, I reopened the little flower shop I had closed after retiring. It sat on a corner in San Antonio, tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. The old sign still bore the name Bloom and Vine, and as soon as I turned the key in the door, memories of bright mornings and laughter returned. The shelves were dusty, the counter worn, but once I set a vase of fresh lilies on the front display, the place breathed again. It did not take long for familiar faces to stop by. Neighbors who remembered the shop years ago welcomed me back with hugs and small orders. They said the street had missed the flowers, and I felt a quiet pride knowing I could bring color back to this part of town. My days filled with arranging roses, hydrangeas, and tulips, hands busy, mind calm. Ethan, my sweet 6-year-old grandson, began visiting almost every afternoon after school. He would tumble in with his backpack sliding off one shoulder, eyes bright as he ran to the counter. "Grandma, can I help today?" he would ask, already reaching for the watering can. I gave him small tasks, letting him trim stems or place daisies in jars, and though he sometimes splashed water across the floor, his laughter was the sound I needed most. Watching him chatter while arranging flowers reminded me that innocence still bloomed even after betrayal had withered so much. Mark came by less often, but when he did, he carried a new heaviness. He was quiet, apologetic, and though he rarely spoke about Cassie, I could see the fracture in his heart. Yet there was also relief in his eyes, as if the truth had freed him even while it left scars. I chose not to lecture him, not to remind him of his blind spots. Instead, I poured him tea, let him sit in silence, and when he looked up with gratitude, that was enough. In the evenings when the shop closed and the sun dipped behind the horizon, I returned home to the folder that had consumed so many of my days. It sat thick with papers, photographs, notes, and sworn statements. Each page told the story of suspicion, pain, and betrayal. I ran my fingers over it, remembering every sleepless night, every quiet tear, every moment I doubted myself. The weight of it was real, but it was not mine to carry anymore. One Saturday, I gathered the entire folder and walked out to the backyard. The air was cool, the sky clear, and I set a small fire in the old steel barrel by the fence. I placed the first document inside, watching the flames curl its edges, the ink darkening before vanishing. One by one, I fed the papers to the fire. Photos of forged signatures, lists of missing items, testimony from friends, each page consumed until only smoke and ash remained. The crackle of the fire was steady, almost soothing. I whispered to myself as the last sheet disappeared. It is over. The past is gone. I will not let it haunt me any longer. As the fire died down, I felt lighter. My hands no longer trembled, my chest no longer carried the weight of secrets. I had given the story its ending, and I had chosen to close the book. Life moved on in gentle rhythms. The shop thrived modestly enough to keep my days busy and my heart full. Ethan's drawings of flowers decorated the walls behind the counter. Customers brought me stories with their orders, and I began to see beauty again, not as a fragile thing, but as something that could endure even after storms. Cassie faded into silence. I heard little of her after that night, only that she had left town for a while. She had become a name whispered with pity or disdain, no longer someone with the power to unsettle me. I did not hate her. Hate would have kept me tied to her forever. Instead, I chose to let her go the same way I let those ashes drift away in the wind. Sometimes when I locked the shop in the evening and walked home with a bouquet of leftover flowers in my arms, I thought of the lesson hidden in it all. The strength was never in loud confrontations or quick accusations. It had been in the waiting, the watching, the patience to let the truth reveal itself. Silence had been my shield, and endurance my weapon. Sitting on my porch at dusk, the air scented with roses and lavender, I finally felt peace. I knew betrayal, yes, but I had also found justice in my own quiet way. And more than that, I had found a path forward surrounded by blooms, laughter, and the steady love of a grandson who made every day brighter. If you have ever carried the sting of betrayal or waited longer than you thought possible for justice to come, perhaps you understand what it means to finally breathe again. I would love to hear your thoughts, your own stories of hurt and healing. Share them with me, and let this space be one where we can find comfort in knowing none of us walk through the shadows alone.